I deserve half of this ranch, my cowgirl daughter-in-law Belle said, spreading forged documents across our kitchen table. She thought I was just a powerless widow who'd roll over after my husband's suspicious death. Belle had no idea I'd spent decades building alliances with everyone from Comanche warriors to federal marshals. When Judge Hayes saw her fake papers, he laughed so hard the whole courthouse heard him. She never expected what came next: her criminal network destroyed, herself dead in Texas dirt, and my ranch protected by federal law. They thought the old woman was powerless until I revealed my secret and took everything back. Now the Sullivan name means justice. Have you ever welcomed someone into your family, only to discover they were planning your destruction from day one? What I found out Belle had really done to Patrick still haunts me. Tell me in the comments, how would you handle discovering your loved one was actually your worst enemy? I stepped out onto the front porch just as dawn painted the Texas sky the color of ripe peaches. The air was thick with summer heat, and our longhorn cattle were already stirring in the distance. This was my favorite time on the Broken Arrow Ranch, when the world belonged to just me and the land Patrick and I had worked for 37 years. My son James was checking the herd, his movements sharp with tension I'd been noticing for weeks. At 32, he had his father's strong hands, but lately there was something haunted in his eyes. Ever since he'd married Belle Crawford 6 months ago, he'd been like a man caught between two lives. "Morning, Mama," James called, but his voice carried a weight that made my chest tighten. "Coffee's ready," I replied. "Doc Morrison's coming to discuss the church social. We're inviting Running Wolf's people this year?" James's face darkened. "Belle won't like that. You know how she feels about the Comanche." That was what worried me most about my daughter-in-law. Out here, survival meant respecting neighbors, regardless of skin color. Running Wolf's wisdom had saved us through harsh winters, but Belle acted like she was above such common associations. James pulled a letter from his pocket, expensive paper that looked out of place on a working ranch. The way he held it, like it might bite him, sent ice through my veins. "What's that?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. "Belle asked me to give you this." His eyes wouldn't meet mine. "She said it's about legal matters." Legal matters? In my experience, when someone couldn't look you in the eye while saying those words, trouble was riding hard toward your door. I took the letter, noting Belle's fancy script across the front. From inside the house came the sound of her moving through my kitchen like she owned it, humming some tune that didn't belong in a ranch house. Lately, she'd been rearranging things, making changes without asking, acting like the Broken Arrow was hers to command. "James," I caught his arm, feeling the tension coiled in his muscles. "If something's troubling you, for a heartbeat." I saw the little boy who used to run to me with scraped knees. Then Belle's laughter drifted from the kitchen, and that moment shattered. "She has ideas, Mama. Modern ideas about how things should be run." Modern ideas. That phrase had been Belle's weapon lately, usually followed by changes that benefited her and hurt everyone else. I folded the letter, my hands steadier than I felt. Whatever was in that envelope, I'd face it. But first, I needed to understand what was happening to my family. A dust cloud appeared on the horizon, someone riding hard toward our ranch. Out here, unexpected visitors meant either celebration or catastrophe. Given the fear I'd seen in my son's eyes and the letter burning in my apron pocket, I knew which one this would be. The rider was getting closer. And something told me that once they arrived, nothing on the Broken Arrow Ranch would ever be the same. I squared my shoulders and prepared to fight for everything Patrick and I had built, even if it meant fighting my own family. The rider turned out to be Belle herself. Though I barely recognized her at first, she came thundering up to our ranch house like some kind of frontier queen. Her dark hair flowing behind her and her riding dress fancier than anything we'd ever seen in these parts. The way she sat that horse straight-backed and proud, you'd think she owned every acre from here to San Antonio. "Martha, darling," Belle called out. dismounting with practiced grace. She'd learned to ride well since marrying James. I'd give her that. But there was something theatrical about the way she moved, like she was performing for an audience instead of just coming home to family. James rushed to take her horse, and I watched the way Belle's hand lingered on his arm just a moment too long. She had a way of touching him that seemed innocent enough, but I'd seen how she used those little gestures to keep him off balance, always seeking her approval. "I hope you don't mind, but I've invited Doc Morrison to stay for supper," I said, testing the waters. He's been such a help since Patrick passed. Belle's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in her green eyes. Of course not, though I do think it's time we started making our own decisions about who visits our home. Our home, not your home, or even the family home. Our home. Like she'd been born and raised on this land instead of showing up 6 months ago with nothing but a carpet bag and a sob story about being orphaned in Arkansas. Inside, Belle moved through our parlor like she was taking inventory. She straightened a doily here, adjusted a picture frame there, all while chatting pleasantly about her ride into town. But I noticed how she lingered near Patrick's old desk, how her fingers traced the edge of his leather-bound ledger. "You know, Martha," she said, settling herself in Patrick's favorite chair without asking, "I've been thinking about all the responsibilities you've been carrying since dear Patrick's passing. It must be such a burden, managing everything alone." The way she said "dear Patrick" made my skin crawl. She'd barely known my husband, and what little time they'd spent together, she'd spent trying to charm him into thinking she was the perfect daughter-in-law. "I manage just fine," I replied, keeping my voice level. "This ranch has been my life's work." "Oh, I'm sure it has." Belle's tone was honey-sweet, but there was steel underneath. "But times are changing. Aren't they? A woman alone can't be expected to handle such complex business matters." James shifted uncomfortably in his chair, caught between his wife's pointed words and his loyalty to me. I could see him struggling, wanting to defend me but afraid of crossing Belle. "Speaking of business matters," Belle continued, reaching into her writing jacket, "I've been reviewing some of Patrick's papers, legal documents, property deeds, that sort of thing." She pulled out a folded document, the paper crisp and official-looking. "It seems there are some, arrangements that weren't properly finalized before he passed." My blood turned to ice water. "What kind of arrangements?" Belle's smile widened, showing all her perfect white teeth. "Well, it appears that Patrick intended for the ranch to be divided equally between his heirs. All his heirs?" She let that sink in for a moment. "I believe the legal term is community property rights." The room went dead silent except for the ticking of Patrick's old clock on the mantel. James looked like he'd been struck by lightning, and I felt the ground shifting beneath my feet like it did during that earthquake back in '75. "That's impossible," I whispered. "Patrick would never." "Oh, but he did, Martha." Belle's voice was gentle, almost pitying. "It's all right here in black and white. I deserve half of this ranch, and I intend to claim what's rightfully mine." The oil lamp flickered as Belle spread the papers across Patrick's old oak table, the same table where he and I had planned every season, every purchase, every dream for 37 years. Now, my daughter-in-law was using it to tear apart everything we'd built together. "See here," Belle pointed to a line of text with her manicured finger. "Patrick's signature, clear as day. He wanted to ensure I'd be taken care of if anything happened to James." I leaned closer, squinting in the lamplight. The handwriting looked like Patrick's, but something felt wrong. The ink seemed too fresh, the paper too clean for a document that should have been months old. My husband had always been careful with legal papers, filing them properly in his desk drawer. But I'd never seen these documents before. "When did he supposedly sign this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Last winter, when he was feeling poorly." Belle's tone was matter-of-fact, like she was discussing the weather. He called me into his study one evening while you were visiting Mrs. Henderson. Said he wanted to make sure the family was protected. That was a lie. Patrick had never had private conversations with Belle. He'd been polite to her, welcoming even, but he'd always been uncomfortable with her forward ways. And I'd never visited Mrs. Henderson. Last winter she'd been in Dallas caring for her sick sister. Mama, James's voice cracked like a teenage boy's. He was standing by the fireplace, his hands clenched at his sides. Is this real? I looked at my son, seeing the agony in his eyes. He was caught between the woman he'd married and the mother who'd raised him, and it was tearing him apart. Belle had positioned herself perfectly if he supported me. He'd be calling his wife a liar. If he supported her, he'd be betraying everything his father had worked for. James, honey, Belle said, moving to his side with that practiced grace of hers. I know this is difficult, but your father was thinking of our future together. He wanted to make sure we'd have security. She placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart, and I watched my son's resolve crumble. Belle had always known exactly how to touch him, how to make him feel like he was the most important thing in her world. The ranch has been in our family for 3 generations, I said, my voice growing stronger despite the trembling in my hands. Patrick's grandfather homesteaded this land. His father died defending it from raiders. Patrick and I built it into something worth having with our own sweat and blood. And now it's James's inheritance, Belle replied smoothly, which makes it mine too, as his wife. Community property. Martha, it's the law. The way she said my name, like I was some old woman who didn't understand modern ways, made my blood boil. But what truly broke my heart was watching James nod along with her words, his loyalty shifting like sand in a windstorm. Patrick never would have done this without telling me. I said, gathering the papers with shaking hands. We made every decision together. Every single one. People change their minds. Martha, Belle's smile was gentle, but her eyes were cold as Winter Creek water, especially when they're facing their mortality. Patrick wanted to ensure his son's wife would be taken care of. Surely you can understand that. I stared down at the documents, at Patrick's familiar signature that somehow felt like a stranger's handwriting. Either my husband had betrayed everything we'd stood for, or the woman sitting in his chair was a liar and a fraud. I need time to think about this, I said finally. Of course you do. Belle began folding the papers with careful precision. But, Martha, dear, I hope you'll remember that this ranch belongs to the next generation now. James and I have plans for modernizing things, making them more efficient. As she tucked the documents back into her jacket, I made a silent vow. Tomorrow, I'd ride into town and find out the truth about these papers. Because if Belle thought she could waltz into my home and steal my life's work with forged documents and sweet lies, she was about to learn what frontier justice really meant. The courthouse sat on Main Street like a weathered sentinel, its adobe walls baked golden by decades of Texas sun. I tied my mare to the hitching post with hands that wouldn't quite steady, then climbed the wooden steps that had creaked under the boots of countless folks seeking justice over the years. Judge Samuel Hayes had been practicing law in our county since before the war, and his office showed it. Law books lined every wall from floor to ceiling, their leather spines cracked and faded. His desk was a monument of organized chaos papers, inkwells, and a coffee cup that looked like it hadn't been washed since Christmas. Martha Sullivan, he said, rising from his chair with the careful movements of a man whose bones remembered too many cold mornings. I was sorry to hear about Patrick. He was a good man. Thank you, Judge. I clutched Belle's documents against my chest like armor. I'm afraid I need your help with a legal matter. His weathered face grew serious as he gestured to the chair across from his desk. Sit yourself down and tell me what's troubling you. I spread Belle's papers across his desk, my hands trembling slightly. My daughter-in-law claims Patrick signed these documents giving her half the ranch. She says it's community property, that she has legal rights. Judge Hayes pulled his spectacles from his vest pocket and perched them on his nose. He picked up the first document, holding it close to the lamp, and I watched his bushy eyebrows draw together in concentration. He murmured, turning the paper to catch the light better. When did she say Patrick signed this? Last winter, while I was supposedly visiting Mrs. Henderson. I leaned forward. But Judge, I never visited Mrs. Henderson last winter. She was in Dallas. His eyes sharpened. Is that so? He set down the first document and picked up the second, examining it with the same careful attention. After a moment, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a magnifying glass. Well, he said, peering through the glass at Patrick's signature. Martha, take a look at this. I leaned across the desk, squinting through the magnifying glass where he pointed. The signature looked right at first glance. But under magnification, I could see something was off. The ink had a different quality, and the pressure of the pen strokes seemed uneven. Now look at this, Judge Hayes said, pulling out a folder from his filing cabinet. This is Patrick's will, filed with the court 2 years ago. He placed the two documents side by side, and even without the magnifying glass, the difference was clear. Patrick's real signature had a distinctive flourish on the P and a particular way of crossing his T. The signature on Belle's documents was close, but not quite right. Judge Hayes leaned back in his chair, and suddenly his shoulders began to shake. At first, I thought he might be having some kind of spell, but then I realized he was laughing a deep, rolling chuckle that grew louder by the second. Judge, I asked, confused. What's so funny? Martha? He said, wiping his eyes with his handkerchief. In 40 years of practicing law, I've seen some bold attempts at forgery, but this... He picked up Belle's document again, shaking his head. This is insulting to anyone with half a brain. You mean it's fake? Fake as a $3 bill. He pointed to several spots on the paper. Look here, the ink is too fresh for a document supposedly signed months ago. The paper stock is wrong for what Patrick used. And this signature, He chuckled again. Whoever forged this practiced on something, but they didn't practice enough. Relief flooded through me like cool water on a scorching day. So Belle has no claim to the ranch. None whatsoever. Judge Hayes gathered the documents and handed them back to me. In fact, if she tries to file these with the court, she could face charges for fraud and forgery? I clutched the papers to my chest, feeling stronger than I had in days. What should I do? Well, Judge Hayes said, his eyes twinkling with something that looked suspiciously like anticipation. I think it's time your daughter-in-law learned that frontier justice doesn't take kindly to folks who try to steal from widows. Armed with Judge Hayes's confirmation, I rode through town with purpose I hadn't felt since Patrick's passing. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street, and I could feel the weight of Belle's forged documents in my saddlebag like stones of truth waiting to be thrown. But proving the documents were forged was only half the battle. I needed to understand who Belle Crawford really was and what she'd been planning all along. My first stop was Abernathy's General Store, where Mrs. Abernathy had been collecting gossip like a magpie collects shiny objects for 30 years. The bell jingled my entrance, and she looked up from her ledger, her sharp gray eyes immediately reading the determination in my face. Martha Sullivan, she said, setting down her pen with deliberate care. You look like a woman on a mission. I need to ask you about Belle, I said without preamble, my boots clicking on the worn wooden floors. What do you know about her background before she married James, Mrs. Abernathy glanced toward the front window, checking for eavesdroppers, then leaned across the counter conspiratorially. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I always wondered about that girl. She claimed to be from Arkansas. Said her folks died in a fever epidemic. But when she first came to town, she had calluses on her hands that looked like they came from dealing cards, not farm work. Dealing cards. My heart quickened. My late husband spent enough time in saloons from here to San Antonio to recognize those particular marks. She traced a pattern on her palm. And I'll tell you something else, she asked too many questions about who owned what land around here. Most newcomers are interested in making friends and finding their place. Belle was interested in making assessments, like she was planning something. I felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place with an almost audible snap. Did she ask about the broken arrow specifically? More than once. Wanted to know how much it was worth, whether Patrick had any debts. If there were other heirs besides James? Mrs. Abernathy shook her head, her gray curls bouncing. At the time, I thought she was just being practical, thinking about her future with James. Now, I'm not so sure she ever cared about James at all. My next stop was the Silver Dollar Saloon, where I found Doc Morrison sharing a whiskey with Tom Fletcher, our blacksmith. The afternoon light filtered through dusty windows, casting everything in a golden haze that reminded me of better times. Both men had known Patrick since before James was born, and their weathered faces grew grave when I explained what Belle had attempted. That doesn't sound like Patrick at all, Doc Morrison said, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles with fingers stained from years of medical work. He was always transparent about his business dealings. Remember when he wanted to expand the South Pasture, he spent weeks discussing it with anyone who'd listen, asking advice, weighing opinions. Tom Fletcher nodded vigorously, his massive arms crossed over his leather apron. And he never made important decisions without you, Martha. Hell, he wouldn't even buy a new horse without asking your opinion first. Said a man who didn't consult his wife was a fool asking for trouble. There's something else, Doc Morrison continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. About 2 months before Patrick passed, Belle came to see me privately. Said she was worried about his mental state. Asked if illness might affect his judgment about legal matters. I told her Patrick's mind was sharp as ever, but the question struck me as mighty odd at the time. She was laying groundwork. I realized, anger building in my chest like a prairie fire. If anyone questioned the documents, she could claim Patrick wasn't thinking clearly when he supposedly signed them. Tom Fletcher spat into the brass spittoon with obvious disgust. That woman's been planning this longer than any of us realized. She played the long game, and we all fell for her act. As I prepared to leave, Doc Morrison caught my arm gently. Martha, there's something you should know. Last week, I was going through Patrick's medical files to close out his account properly. I found a sealed note he'd written and asked me to keep safe in my office strongbox. Said if anything ever happened to him, I should make sure you saw it. With trembling hands, he pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket, in Patrick's familiar handwriting, slightly shaky from illness, but unmistakably his. It read, If Belle ever tries to claim any part of the broken arrow, know that I never promised her anything. The ranch belongs to Martha and our family legacy. She earned every acre through love, sweat, and hard work beside me. My eyes filled with tears as I read my husband's words. His final gift of protection reaching across the grave. Even in death, he was still fighting for me, still defending what we'd built together with our own hands. He suspected something, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. Patrick was nobody's fool, Doc Morrison said gently, his weathered hand patting my shoulder. He saw through her pretty face and sweet words clear as mountain water. He just didn't live long enough to do anything about it himself. I folded the note carefully and tucked it into my reticule next to Belle's forged documents. The contrast was stark truth and lies, love and greed, all carried together in my worn leather bag. Now I had proof of forgery, testimony from respected community members, and Patrick's own words declaring his true intentions. Belle Crawford had made a fatal mistake. She'd underestimated the bonds of a frontier community and the enduring memory of a good man. Tomorrow, it would be time to show her the consequences of that miscalculation. The sun was setting behind the mesquite trees when I rode toward the creek where Running Wolf's band had made their winter camp. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and the distant sound of children's laughter, reminding me that some things remained constant even when my world felt turned upside down. Running Wolf emerged from his lodge as I approached, his weathered face creased in welcome. At 52, he moved with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen both war and peace, who had learned to navigate between two worlds without losing his soul to either. "Martha Sullivan," he said in his careful English, gesturing for me to dismount. "You carry the weight of trouble on your shoulders. Come, sit by the fire and speak your heart." I had known Running Wolf for 15 years. Ever since Patrick and I had helped his people through a harsh winter when government supplies failed to arrive. In return, he had shared his knowledge of the land, teaching us which plants could heal and which streams never ran dry. Our friendship had been built on mutual respect and honest dealing, something Belle would never understand. As we settled beside the fire, I pulled out Belle's forged documents and Patrick's protective note. Running Wolf listened without interruption as I explained everything, his dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. When I finished, he sat in thoughtful silence for several minutes, a habit I had learned to respect. "In my people's way," he finally said, "when someone tries to steal what belongs to another, they steal more than property. They steal honor. They steal the work of hands and heart. They steal the connection between generations." He picked up a stick and stirred the fire, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. "Your husband was a man who kept his word. In all our dealings, Patrick Sullivan spoke truth. This woman—" He gestured toward Belle's documents with obvious distaste. "She speaks with a forked tongue, as we say. She dishonors not only you, but the memory of a good man." "I know she's lying," I said, my voice tight with emotion. "But proving it in a way that matters, that's the challenge. Some folks might think I'm just a bitter old woman who can't accept change." Running Wolf shook his head slowly. "You are not old, and you are not bitter. You are a warrior protecting her tribe, her land, her legacy. This is the most sacred duty." He reached into a leather pouch at his side and pulled out a small object, a piece of turquoise carved into the shape of an eagle. "My grandmother gave this to me when I became a man. She said the eagle sees truth from great heights, sees patterns that those on the ground cannot. She told me to give it to someone who needed such vision." He pressed the stone into my palm, his calloused fingers warm against mine. "I believe that time has come." The turquoise felt smooth and cool in my hand, and somehow its weight steadied me. "What do you think I should do? In the old days, when someone committed a great wrong against the tribe, we did not hide the truth in shadows. We brought it into the light of day, before all the people, so that justice could be seen and understood by everyone." His eyes met mine across the fire. "Your people have their own ways, but the principle is the same. Truth spoken in sunlight burns away, lies like morning burns away mist." I thought about his words, about the power of community witness, about the importance of public accountability. Belle had been counting on shame and confusion to keep me silent. But Running Wolf was right. Truth needed to be spoken where everyone could hear it. "There's something else," Running Wolf continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "This woman, she has the smell of someone who has done this before. Be careful. Martha Sullivan, a person who steals once will steal again, and they grow more dangerous when cornered." As I prepared to leave, Running Wolf walked me to my horse. The stars were beginning to appear in the vast Texas sky, and I felt a peace I hadn't experienced since Patrick's death. "Thank you," I said, clutching the turquoise eagle. "For the wisdom, for the warning, for believing in the truth." "Truth is like water," he replied, helping me into the saddle. "It always finds its way to the surface, no matter how much dirt someone throws on top of it." As I rode home under the starlight, I knew exactly what I had to do. Tomorrow, I would bring Belle's lies into the full light of day, before the whole community, and with Patrick's words, the judge's expertise, and Running Wolf's blessing. I would reclaim what was rightfully mine. The next morning, I rode into town with Running Wolf's turquoise eagle tucked safely in my pocket and a plan forming in my mind like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The first stop was Judge Hayes's office, where I found him already reviewing law books with the methodical precision of a man preparing for battle. "Martha," he said, looking up from a thick volume of property law, "I've been thinking about your situation all night. We need to handle this publicly, with proper witnesses, so there can be no question about the outcome." "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." I settled into the chair across from his desk. "I want to call a community meeting. Let Belle present her case in front of everyone. Then expose her lies where the whole town can see." Judge Hayes leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. "Like the old circuit court days, when justice was a community affair. I like it. When, tomorrow evening at the church, Reverend Matthews will let us use the building, and it's big enough for everyone who'll want to attend." I pulled out Patrick's note and Belle's forged documents. "I want you to examine these papers in front of the whole community. Explain exactly why they're fraudulent." "It'll be my pleasure." He took the documents, handling them like the evidence they were. "I'll also bring some of Patrick's legitimate papers from my files for comparison. The differences will be obvious even to folks without legal training." My next stop was Doc Morrison's clinic, where I found him tending to old Pete Garrison's rheumatism. After Pete left, Doc Morrison listened to my plan with growing enthusiasm. "A public hearing is exactly what this situation needs," he said, washing his hands in the basin. "Belle's been counting on shame and confusion to keep you quiet. Once everyone hears the truth together, she won't be able to manipulate individual conversations anymore." "Will you speak about Patrick's mental state about Belle's suspicious questions?" "Absolutely. And I'll bring that note he left with me." Doc Morrison dried his hands on a clean towel. "Martha, I've already spoken to Tom Fletcher and several of the other men. They're all planning to attend, and they're not happy about what Belle tried to pull. By afternoon, word had spread through town like wildfire. Mrs. Abernathy had told every customer who entered her store, and each of them had carried the news to their neighbors. The prospect of a public confrontation over the Broken Arrow Ranch had captured everyone's attention. I was surprised to find Running Wolf waiting by my horse when I came out of the mercantile. He rarely came into town, preferring to conduct business on the outskirts. But today he stood calmly despite the curious stares from passers-by. "I heard about your gathering tomorrow," he said quietly. "My people have a saying, 'Truth needs many voices to be heard above the wind of lies.' I will come, if you wish it." "I would be honored," I replied, touched by his offer. "Your testimony about Patrick's character will carry weight, and it will show this Belle woman that she has made enemies of more than just you." His dark eyes held a steely determination. "Someone who dishonors the dead dishonors all who knew them." That evening, I sat on my front porch watching the sun set over the land Patrick and I had built together. Belle was inside, probably planning what she'd say tomorrow, confident that her forged documents and tearful performance would sway the community. James sat beside her, torn between loyalty and truth, still believing his wife's lies. I fingered the turquoise eagle in my pocket, drawing strength from Running Wolf's wisdom and the support of friends who had known Patrick's true character. Tomorrow, Belle would face not just me, but an entire community that valued honesty and hard work above smooth words and pretty faces. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted my thoughts. Judge Hayes rode up, his expression serious but determined. Martha, I wanted you to know I've sent word to the county seat. If Belle's documents are as fraudulent as we believe, there could be criminal charges. Forgery and attempted fraud are serious crimes. Even out here. I nodded, feeling the weight of what tomorrow would bring. She made her choice when she decided to steal from a dead man's widow. Now she'll face the consequences. As Judge Hayes rode away, I looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the vast Texas sky. Patrick was up there somewhere, and I knew he'd be proud of the fight I was about to wage. Tomorrow, truth would triumph over lies, and the Broken Arrow Ranch would remain where it belonged in the hands of those who had earned it through love, sweat, and honest work. The church was packed tighter than a cattle car by the time evening shadows fell across Main Street. Every pew was filled with ranchers, shopkeepers, their wives and older children, folks who had known Patrick Sullivan and respected the work he'd done for our community. Even Running Wolf sat in the back, his presence a quiet statement that transcended the usual boundaries between our peoples. Belle entered like she was attending a social gathering, her green silk dress rustling as she walked down the center aisle with James at her side. She had styled her hair in elaborate curls and wore a confident smile that suggested she viewed this as nothing more than a formality before claiming her prize. Judge Hayes stood at the front, his law books spread across the altar like sacred texts. Reverend Matthews had agreed to moderate, his gentle nature providing the perfect balance to the judge's legal authority. Friends, Reverend Matthews began, his voice carrying easily through the packed church. We're gathered tonight to hear a dispute about Patrick Sullivan's final wishes regarding the Broken Arrow Ranch. Mrs. Belle Sullivan has requested this public hearing to present her claim. Belle rose gracefully, smoothing her skirts as she approached the front. Thank you, Reverend. I appreciate this opportunity to share the truth with all of Patrick's dear friends. Her voice was honey-sweet, calculated to tug at heartstrings. As you all know, Patrick was like a father to me during his final months. In his wisdom, he recognized that the ranch needed young, capable hands to guide it into the future. She pulled out her forged documents with theatrical flair. These papers, signed in his own hand, grant me equal ownership of the Broken Arrow as his son's wife. Murmurs rippled through the congregation as Belle held up the documents. Several people leaned forward, squinting to see Patrick's supposed signature. She had chosen her moment well. The lamplight made the papers look official and impressive. Patrick knew that Martha, bless her heart, might struggle with the business aspects of running such a large operation. He wanted to ensure the ranch would prosper for future generations. Belle's voice cracked slightly, as if overcome with emotion. It pains me to press this claim, but I must honor his final wishes. Judge Hayes stood slowly, his weathered face grave. Mrs. Sullivan, may I examine those documents? Of course. Judge. Belle handed over the papers with confidence, clearly expecting his approval. The church fell silent as Judge Hayes put on his spectacles and held the first document up to the lamp. After a moment, he reached into his coat and pulled out a magnifying glass, studying the signature with careful attention. Interesting, he said finally, his voice carrying a note that made Belle's smile falter slightly. Very interesting indeed. He walked to his law books and pulled out a folder. I have here Patrick Sullivan's actual will, filed with the county court 2 years ago, along with several other documents bearing his genuine signature. Judge Hayes held up both sets of papers, side by side, where the entire congregation could see them. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been practicing law for 40 years, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that these signatures are not the work of the same hand. The church erupted in shocked whispers. Belle's face went pale beneath her carefully applied rouge. Furthermore, Judge Hayes continued, raising his voice above the murmur, the paper stock is wrong. The ink is too fresh for documents supposedly signed months ago, and the legal language contains errors that Patrick, who was meticulous about such things, would never have approved. I stood, feeling the weight of the entire community's attention. Judge Hayes, I have something else the folks should hear. I walked to the front and pulled out Patrick's protective note, the one Doc Morrison had safeguarded. This is a letter Patrick wrote and left with Doc Morrison, to be opened only if something like this ever happened. My voice grew stronger as I read Patrick's words aloud. If Belle ever tries to claim any part of the Broken Arrow, know that I never promised her anything. The ranch belongs to Martha and our family legacy. She earned every acre through love, sweat, and hard work beside me. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Running Wolf stood in the back of the church, his voice cutting through the tension. Patrick Sullivan was a man who kept his word. In all our dealings, he spoke truth. These papers. He gestured toward Belle's documents with obvious contempt. They dishonor a good man's memory. Belle's composure finally cracked. You can't all believe these lies. I'm his son's wife. I have rights. You have the right to leave this town. Tom Fletcher called out from his pew. Before we decide to involve the sheriff. The murmur of agreement that swept through the church was like thunder rolling across the prairie. Belle looked around desperately, seeing only hostile faces where she'd expected sympathy. James stood slowly, his face a mask of shame and confusion. Belle, he said quietly, did you really forge these papers? The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. And in that moment, everyone in the church knew the answer. Belle's face had gone white as fresh milk, but her eyes blazed with the desperate fury of a cornered wildcat. She looked around the church, seeing nothing but hostile faces staring back at her, and I could practically watch her calculating her next move. This is ridiculous, she said, her voice rising to a pitch that made several people wince. You're all taking the word of a bitter old woman over legal documents. I'm James's wife. I have rights under the law. The only thing you have, Judge Hayes said coldly, is a date with the county sheriff for forgery and fraud. That's when Mrs. Abernathy stood up in her pew, her gray hair practically bristling with indignation. I think it's time everyone knew exactly who Belle Crawford really is. Belle's head snapped toward the storekeeper like a rattlesnake sensing danger. What are you talking about? After our conversation yesterday? Martha, I sent a telegram to my cousin in Little Rock. He runs a hotel there and knows everyone who passes through. Mrs. Abernathy's voice carried clearly through the silent church. Turns out Belle Crawford is quite well known in Arkansas, just not for the reasons she told us. You had no right, Belle started, but Mrs. Abernathy cut her off. Her real name is Bella Crenshaw, and she's wanted for questioning in connection with the suspicious death of an elderly rancher named Ezekiel Thornton. Seems old Ezekiel married a young woman who claimed to be an orphan, and 3 months later he was dead and his property had mysteriously been transferred to his grieving widow. The church erupted in shocked gasps and angry murmurs. James looked like he'd been struck by lightning, his face cycling through disbelief, horror, and dawning understanding. That's a lie, Belle screamed, but her voice cracked with panic. I was never married to anyone named Thornton. The telegram also mentioned, Mrs. Abernathy continued relentlessly, that Bella Crenshaw was known to frequent gambling halls and had been arrested twice for running confidence games on lonely widowers. Running Wolf stood again, his voice cutting through the chaos with quiet authority. In my people's way, we have a word for someone like this. Shapeshifter, one who wears different faces to deceive and steal. They are the most dangerous kind of enemy because they live among you as friends. Belle's composure finally shattered completely. You don't understand. I needed that money. Ezekiel was old. He was dying anyway, and Patrick, he was already sick when I got here. I just helped things along. The church went dead silent. Even the children seemed to sense that something terrible had just been revealed. Helped things along, how? Judge Hayes asked, his voice deadly quiet. Belle realized what she'd said and clamped her mouth shut. But it was too late. The damage was done. James stepped away from his wife like she was a poisonous snake. Belle, what did you do to my father? Nothing, I didn't do anything, but her voice was shrill with panic now, and everyone could hear the lie in it. Doc Morrison stood slowly, his medical bag in his hand. Judge, I think we need to have a serious conversation about Patrick's final illness. There were some symptoms that didn't quite fit the diagnosis. Things that bothered me at the time, but I couldn't explain. You're all crazy, Belle shouted, backing toward the church door. I'm leaving this godforsaken town, and good riddance. No, you're not, Tom Fletcher said, moving to block her path. His massive frame filled the doorway like a mountain. Sheriff's already been sent for. You're not going anywhere until he gets here. Belle looked around wildly. Trapped like a rat in a grain bin, the woman who had walked into the church like a queen was gone, replaced by a desperate criminal whose carefully constructed lies had crumbled to dust. James, she said, turning to her husband with tears streaming down her face. You have to believe me. I love you. Everything I did was for us, for our future together. But James was staring at her like she was a stranger. Did you kill my father? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Belle's silence was answer enough. I stood in the midst of the chaos, feeling a mixture of vindication and sadness. I had wanted to expose Belle's lies and save my ranch, but I hadn't expected to uncover a murderer. Patrick's death hadn't been natural after all, it had been the final act in Belle's deadly game. The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the sheriff's arrival. Justice was coming to the frontier, and Belle Crawford, or Bella Crenshaw, or whatever her real name was, would finally face the consequences of her crimes. Sheriff Bill Hawkins filled the church doorway like an avenging angel, his silver badge catching the lamplight and his weathered hand resting on the butt of his Colt .45. Behind him stood 2 deputies, their faces grim with the seriousness of their mission. Evening, folks, the sheriff said, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years keeping peace in frontier Texas. His eyes swept the packed church before settling on Belle, who had pressed herself against the far wall like a trapped animal. I got word there's been some trouble here tonight. Judge Hayes stepped forward, his law books tucked under his arm like evidence in a court case. Sheriff Hawkins, we have a situation involving forgery, fraud, and possibly murder. This woman, he pointed at Belle, has been operating under a false name and has admitted to hastening Patrick Sullivan's death. Belle's head snapped up, her eyes wild with desperation. I never admitted anything. These people are lying. They're trying to frame me because they don't want to accept Patrick's final wishes. Is that so? Sheriff Hawkins walked slowly down the center aisle, his spurs jingling with each step. Well, ma'am, I just had an interesting conversation with the Arkansas authorities. Seems they've been looking for a woman matching your description in connection with several suspicious deaths. The color drained from Belle's face completely. I don't know what you're talking about. Bella Crenshaw, the sheriff continued, pulling out a wanted poster from his coat. Also known as Belle Crawford, Isabella Thornton, and at least 3 other names we know of. Wanted for questioning in the deaths of 4 elderly men, all of whom died shortly after marrying young women who inherited their property. Mrs. Abernathy stood up again, her voice ringing with righteous indignation. Sheriff, she as good as confessed to poisoning Patrick Sullivan right here in front of all of us. I never said poison. Belle shrieked, then immediately realized her mistake. Sheriff Hawkins raised an eyebrow. Nobody mentioned poison? Ma'am, that's a mighty specific denial for someone who claims innocence. The church was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Even the children seemed to understand they were witnessing something momentous. James Sullivan, the sheriff said, turning to my devastated son. I'm going to need you to come to the courthouse tomorrow. We'll need a full statement about your wife's behavior during your father's illness. James nodded numbly, unable to even look at the woman he'd married. She was always making him special teas. Said they'd help with the pain. And she was the one who suggested we not call Doc Morrison during those last few days. Doc Morrison stood up, his medical bag clutched in his hands. Sheriff, I'd like to examine Patrick's body. If there was poison involved, there might still be traces we can detect. Already arranged. Doc, we'll be opening the grave tomorrow morning. Sheriff Hawkins turned back to Belle, who was now openly weeping. Bella Crenshaw, you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and suspicion of murder. You have the right to remain silent, though it seems a bit late for that. As the deputies moved to restrain Belle, she made one last desperate plea. James, you can't let them do this. I'm your wife, I love you. But James had turned away, his shoulders shaking with grief and shame. The man who had been torn between two loyalties now saw clearly which side held the truth. Running Wolf stood as Belle was led past his pew. The spirits of the dead do not rest easy when their killers walk free, he said quietly. Patrick Sullivan will find peace now. As the sheriff and his deputies escorted Belle from the church, the entire congregation seemed to exhale at once. The tension that had filled the building like smoke finally began to clear. Judge Hayes approached me, his weathered face creased with something that looked like satisfaction. Martha, I'll need you to come to the courthouse first thing tomorrow. We'll need to file the proper paperwork to invalidate those forged documents and confirm your rightful ownership of the broken arrow. I nodded, still feeling like I was in a dream. Judge, will there be enough evidence to convict her, with her own admissions tonight, the testimony of this entire congregation, and whatever Doc Morrison finds when he examines Patrick's remains? Judge Hayes smiled grimly. I'd say Bella Crenshaw's days of preying on decent folks are over. As the crowd began to file out of the church, many people stopped to shake my hand or offer words of support. The community that had rallied around me tonight would remember this moment the night truth triumphed over lies, and justice came to the frontier. I stood in the empty church for a moment, looking up at the simple wooden cross that hung above the altar. Patrick's murderer had been caught. His memory had been vindicated, and the ranch we'd built together was safe. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, justice had been served. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Broken Arrow Ranch as I stood in my kitchen, holding the official documents that restored everything Patrick and I had built. 3 days had passed since Belle's arrest, but the victory felt hollow. Justice was served, but my husband was still dead murdered by the woman my son had loved. James sat at our kitchen table, looking like he'd aged a decade in a week. The coffee in his cup had gone cold hours ago, but he kept staring into it like it held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. Mama, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. How do I live with knowing I brought his killer into our home? Before I could answer, hoofbeats thundered into our yard. Through the window, I saw Sheriff Hawkins dismounting fast, his face grim as winter storm clouds. Behind him rode a man I didn't recognize, well-dressed, official-looking, with the bearing of someone who carried bad news for a living. Mrs. Sullivan, Sheriff Hawkins called, not bothering with pleasantries. We need to talk, now. My blood turned to ice water. Belle was supposed to be safely locked away, awaiting trial. What could possibly bring the sheriff racing to my door with such urgency? James and I stepped onto the porch as the stranger approached. Removing his hat with practiced courtesy, Ma'am, I'm Federal Marshal Clayton Webb. I'm here about the Bella Crenshaw case. What about it? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. She escaped custody last night, the Marshal said bluntly. Killed a deputy in the process. We believe she's headed back this way. The world tilted sideways. That's impossible. She was in chains. She had help, Sheriff Hawkins said grimly. Turns out she's been part of a larger operation, a whole network of people who prey on frontier families. They've been watching this situation, and they don't intend to let their best asset hang for murder. James stood up so fast his chair toppled backward. You mean there are more of them? At least 3 others we know of, Marshal Webb replied. And Belle knows this ranch. Knows your routines. Knows exactly how to hurt you where it counts most. I felt the turquoise eagle in my pocket, Running Wolf's gift of protection, and drew strength from its smooth weight. What do you need us to do? Pack light and come to town? Sheriff Hawkins said. We've got deputies watching the roads, but Belle's smart and she's desperate. She'll try to finish what she started here. No, the word came out harder than I intended. I won't be driven from my own land by that murderer. Martha, James said, his voice tight with fear. She killed Pa. If she comes back, then she'll find out what frontier justice really looks like, I interrupted, my hand moving instinctively to Patrick's old rifle hanging over the mantel. This is our home, son, our legacy. I didn't fight to save it just to abandon it now. Marshal Webb studied my face with sharp eyes. Ma'am, I respect your courage, but Belle Crenshaw isn't just a common criminal. She's a killer who's been doing this for years, and she's got nothing left to lose. Neither do I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. Sheriff, how long do we have? She could be here by nightfall, he admitted. Maybe sooner if she knows shortcuts through the backcountry. I looked out over the land Patrick and I had worked, the cattle we'd raised, the legacy we'd built with our own hands. Belle had already taken my husband's life and nearly stolen our ranch. I wouldn't let her take anything more. Then we'd better get ready, I said, checking the rifle's action with movements Patrick had taught me years ago. James, ride to Running Wolf's camp. Tell him we need warriors, not witnesses. As my son galloped away and the lawmen prepared their defenses, I stood on my porch watching the horizon. Belle was coming back to finish her deadly game, but this time, she'd find the Broken Arrow Ranch ready for war. The sun hung low when James returned with Running Wolf and 5 painted warriors. Behind them rode Doc Morrison, Tom Fletcher, and neighbors who refused to abandon us. Sheriff Hawkins positioned his men around the ranch house while Marshal Webb crouched behind the water trough. The bonds of friendship are stronger than fear, Running Wolf said, scanning the horizon. We stand with the Sullivan family. There, James pointed at approaching dust clouds. 4 riders, coming fast. Belle led the charge on a stolen horse, her face twisted with murderous rage. 3 hard cases flanked her, the kind of men who'd follow a killer for money. Martha Sullivan, Belle screamed across the yard. You cost me everything, now I'm taking everything from you. You already tried, I called back, stepping onto the porch with Patrick's rifle. How'd that work out? Belle raised her pistol. Say goodbye to your precious ranch, you old... Sheriff Hawkins fired first. The quiet evening exploded into chaos as bullets splintered porch railings and shattered windows. Running Wolf's warriors moved like shadows, flanking the attackers with deadly grace. Tom Fletcher's shotgun boomed, dropping one of Belle's men. I tracked Belle as she circled toward the house. Patrick had taught me to shoot true, and I'd never forgotten. My rifle kicked hard, Belle's horse reared, throwing her into the dirt. She's mine, I shouted, jumping from the porch. Belle rolled up, bloody but still armed. You should have stayed quiet, old woman. You deserved a rope, I replied, advancing steadily. I'll settle for justice. Belle's shot went wide, panic making her shake. Mine didn't miss. The woman who murdered my husband fell backward into Texas dirt where she belonged. Her gun slipped from dead fingers as the remaining attackers fled or surrendered. It's over, Sheriff Hawkins announced. I stood over Belle's body, feeling only deep weariness. Justice was served, but it couldn't bring Patrick back. Running Wolf touched my shoulder gently. Your husband's spirit can rest now. as sunset painted the sky blood red. I knew he was right. But as Marshal Webb approached, his face carried new concern that made my stomach clench. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said quietly, "there's something you need to know. Belle wasn't the leader of this operation, she was just the best at what they do. We found correspondence in her saddlebags. There are others, and they know about what happened here." My blood chilled. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this network is bigger than we thought, and now that you've cost them their most valuable asset." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "They might decide the Sullivan family needs to be made an example of." The victory I'd felt moments ago crumbled like sand. Belle was dead, but the threat to my family, to everything Patrick and I had built, was far from over. "How many others?" I asked. Marshal Webb's grim expression told me everything. "We're not sure, but Mrs. Sullivan, I don't think your fight is finished yet." 3 months after Belle's death, I woke to the sound of gunfire echoing across the Broken Arrow ranch. My hand found Patrick's rifle before my feet hit the floor, muscle memory from months of living with constant threat. But as I peered through the window, I saw James and Running Wolf's son practicing their marksmanship by the old oak tree, their laughter carrying on the morning breeze. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sounds of violence had become sounds of preparation, of friendship, of life continuing despite the shadows that still haunted our borders. "Morning, Mama," James called as I stepped onto the porch, coffee in one hand, rifle in the other. The habit of being armed had become as natural as breathing. "Little Wolf's getting better with that Winchester. Says he wants to be ready if Belle's friends come calling." "And they will," I replied, settling into Patrick's old rocking chair. Marshal Webb's warnings had proven prophetic. Twice we'd spotted suspicious riders, and Sheriff Hawkins had arrested 3 men asking pointed questions about the Sullivan family in various towns. Belle's criminal network was wounded but not destroyed. The difference was, we were ready for them now. Running Wolf emerged from the barn where he'd been checking on our newest foal, a spirited filly with her mother's intelligence and her father's stubborn streak. His presence on our ranch had become as natural as sunrise. The alliance forged in battle growing into something deeper than friendship. "The little one grows strong," he said, approaching the porch. "Like her people, she learns to survive in difficult times." "Speaking of survival," James said, his voice taking on a tone I'd learned to recognize, "I've been corresponding with Sarah Mitchell, the school teacher from San Antonio. She's different from before." "Different how?" I asked, though I already knew what he meant. "Honest, direct. When I told her about Belle, about what happened here, she didn't flinch. Said a man who'd learned to recognize lies was worth knowing." James's smile was tentative but genuine. "I'd like you to meet her, if you're willing." Before I could answer, the thunder of hoofbeats announced visitors. My grip tightened on the rifle until I recognized Judge Hayes leading a small procession. Mrs. Abernathy in her buggy, Tom Fletcher, Doc Morrison, and several other neighbors whose faces carried news. "Martha," Judge Hayes called, dismounting with obvious excitement. "We've got word from the territorial capital. The governor's signed legislation creating a new county sheriff's department with expanded authority to track criminal networks across state lines." And Mrs. Abernathy added, practically bouncing in her seat, "They're naming it after Patrick, the Sullivan County Sheriff's Department. His legacy will protect families across the territory." My throat tightened with emotion. Patrick's name would live on in service to others, ensuring no family would face what we'd endured without proper protection. "There's more," Tom Fletcher continued, his weathered face creased with satisfaction. "The territorial legislature passed the Sullivan Act, makes it a federal crime to prey on widows and elderly landowners through fraud or coercion. Every criminal like Belle will face federal prosecution." As our friends gathered on the porch, sharing news and plans, I felt the weight of the past months settling into something like peace. But peace on the frontier was never permanent. It was something you earned daily through vigilance, courage, and the support of good neighbors. Running Wolf caught my eye and nodded toward the horizon where dust clouds were forming. 3 riders, he said quietly, moving with purpose. My hand found the rifle stock as James and the other men casually took positions around the porch. We'd learned to read danger in the set of shoulders, the angle of approach, the way strangers held their reins. But as the riders drew closer, I recognized Sheriff Hawkins's badge glinting in the sunlight. Behind him rode 2 federal marshals, their faces grim but not threatening. "Mrs. Sullivan," Sheriff Hawkins called. "We've got news about Belle's network. The kind of news that changes everything." I stood, feeling the familiar weight of challenge settling on my shoulders. The Broken Arrow Ranch had survived one test, but the frontier always had another waiting. "Then you'd better come up and tell us," I said, my voice steady despite the quickening of my pulse. "Because whatever's coming next, we'll face it together." The Sullivan name had become synonymous with justice in our territory, but I had a feeling our story was far from over.